September 3rd, 1944. Taroa Island, Marshall Islands. The bent-wing birds sat on the coral strip in the pre-dawn darkness, their massive radial engines ticking as they cooled. 20 F4U Corsairs from Marine Air Group 31, each loaded with a single 1,000-pound bomb. The mission briefing had been routine. Dive at 60 degrees from 8,000 feet, release at 3,000, turn for home. Standard operating procedure that every Marine pilot had flown dozens of times before. Except one pilot wasn't a Marine. He wasn't even in the military. Charles Augustus Lindbergh, 42 years old, civilian technical representative for United Aircraft Corporation, walked the flight line with a notebook in his hand and a question that would change everything. The crew chief had just told him the Corsair was rated to carry 1,000 pounds of ordnance. The manual said so, Vought's engineers said so, every squadron commander in the Pacific said so. Lindbergh looked at the aircraft, did some calculations in his head, and said 5 words that made the Marine lieutenant stop cold. What if we tripled that? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics seemed impossible. The F4U Corsair, for all its power and speed, was a fighter first. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, driving a 13-foot 4-inch propeller that gave it speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. But fighters weren't designed to haul bombs like heavy bombers. They were built for speed, maneuverability, and the ability to engage enemy aircraft in aerial combat. The bomb racks bolted beneath the fuselage and wings were afterthoughts, field modifications that let Marines provide close air support when Japanese fighters stopped showing up. Every pilot knew the limits. 1,000 pounds total, maybe 1,500 if you were feeling brave and the runway was long enough and you prayed the whole way up. But 3,000 pounds? That was insanity. That was asking a fighter to perform like a dive bomber while still maintaining enough control authority to actually hit the target and make it home. The engineers at Vought Aircraft had done the stress calculations. The airframe could theoretically handle more weight, but takeoff distance would increase dramatically. Fuel consumption would skyrocket. The margin for error would vanish. And if something went wrong, if an engine coughed or a tire blew or the pilot misjudged his rotation speed by even 5 knots, the result would be a fireball at the end of the runway and a name added to the casualty lists. But Lindbergh wasn't an engineer bound by theoretical calculations written in Connecticut. He was a pilot who understood aircraft the way a musician understands an instrument. He'd spent 17 years since his transatlantic flight testing, the absolute limits of what aircraft could do. He'd flown everything from barnstorming biplanes to the Spirit of St. Louis to cutting-edge military prototypes. And he'd spent the last 4 months in the Pacific Theater, first with Marine Corsair squadrons, then with Army P-38 Lightning units, learning one fundamental truth that would save hundreds of American lives. The official specifications were just starting points. The real capabilities lay hidden in the margins, waiting for someone willing to question what everyone knew was impossible. The crisis that brought Lindbergh to the Pacific had been brewing since early 1943. Marine fighter squadrons were running out of targets. By February, Corsair units in the Solomons had established air superiority so completely that Japanese aircraft rarely appeared. The enemy had shifted tactics, pulling back to heavily fortified island bases where they could use anti-aircraft artillery and entrenched positions to bleed the American advance. Each bypassed island became a thorn, requiring constant attention to prevent Japanese forces from interdicting supply lines or launching surprise attacks. The solution seemed obvious. Use fighters as fighter bombers, hitting these strong points with high explosives, while maintaining the ability to defend themselves if enemy aircraft appeared. But the Corsair's limited bomb-carrying capacity meant missions required multiple sorties to achieve what a single B-24 Liberator could accomplish in one run. And B-24s were desperately needed elsewhere, supporting MacArthur's drive toward the Philippines. Captain Francis Clark, a Marine fighter pilot with VMF-113, had been thinking about this problem for months. At Kwajalein Atoll, the Navy had stockpiled hundreds of 2,000-pound bombs, originally intended for heavy bombers. The bunkers sat full, while Corsairs made repeated runs with 1,000-pounders that barely scratched the concrete fortifications the Japanese had built. Clark started sketching designs for a centerline bomb rack that could carry the heavier ordnance. The mathematics worked on paper. The Corsair's structure could handle the weight. But no one had actually tried it, because the official specifications said it couldn't be done. Then Lindbergh arrived. His presence in the Pacific was itself a minor miracle of bureaucratic circumvention. America's most famous aviator had been effectively blacklisted from military service. His opposition to American involvement in the war before Pearl Harbor, his speeches for the America First Committee, his public statements that some interpreted as sympathetic to Nazi Germany, all of it had earned him the permanent enmity of President Franklin Roosevelt. When Lindbergh tried to rejoin the Army Air Forces after Pearl Harbor, offering to serve in any capacity, Roosevelt personally refused to restore his colonel's commission. So Lindbergh found another way. Henry Ford hired him to work on B-24 production at the Willow Run plant. Then United Aircraft Corporation brought him on as a technical consultant for their Corsair program. And in April 1944, Marine Brigadier General Louis Woods arranged for Lindbergh to visit Marine squadrons in the Pacific as a civilian technical representative. The White House wasn't informed. Neither was Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox. Lindbergh bought Navy uniforms from Brooks Brothers, carefully removing any rank insignia, and flew to Hawaii as just another civilian contractor visiting forward bases. Except Lindbergh didn't just visit. He flew. On May 22, 1944, he strapped into a Corsair at Green Island and escorted Grumman TBF torpedo bombers to Rabaul, one of the most heavily defended targets in the Pacific. He strafed ground targets. He engaged in the kind of close-quarters combat that had killed dozens of pilots. And when he returned, he immediately started asking questions that made Marine squadron commanders simultaneously excited and nervous. The Corsair, Lindbergh observed, was burning fuel inefficiently. Pilots had been trained to run their engines rich, especially during cruise phases, because rich mixtures kept cylinder head temperatures down and provided safety margins. But rich mixtures meant dumping excess fuel through the engine as coolant. Lindbergh had spent years studying engine performance, first at the Wright engine plant, then working with Pratt & Whitney on the Corsair's R2800. He understood something most combat pilots didn't. The published settings in the technical manuals were designed for worst-case scenarios, flown by inexperienced pilots, maintained by mechanics of varying skill levels, operated in every possible environmental condition from Arctic cold to equatorial heat. But these weren't inexperienced pilots. These were combat veterans who knew their aircraft intimately. And the conditions in the Pacific, while challenging, were relatively consistent. High temperatures, high humidity, but predictable, which meant the engines could be run leaner than the manual specified without risk of detonation or overheating. All it required was careful attention to instrument readings and a willingness to trust the mathematics over the officially sanctioned procedures. Lindbergh proposed a technique that sounded reckless to pilots who'd spent years following technical orders. Reduce RPM to 1400. Increase manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury. Lean the mixture until cylinder head temperatures rose to 226 degrees Celsius, then enrich slightly to stabilize. The settings violated everything in the pilot's handbook. The manual said never exceed 218 degrees for continuous operation. It said maintain at least 1600 RPM at cruise power. It said run rich mixtures during extended flights to protect the engine. But Lindbergh's settings worked. During his flights with Marine squadrons from Green Island and Emerald, his Corsair consistently returned with 50 to 70 gallons more fuel than other pilots flying identical profiles. That extra fuel translated to roughly an additional hour of flight time or an extra 200 miles of range, or the ability to loiter over a target area providing close air support while other fighters had to turn for home. The squadron commanders saw the data and understood the implications immediately. Extended range meant Marines could hit targets deeper into Japanese-held territory. Extended loiter time meant better protection for ground forces during amphibious assaults, and the fuel savings meant fewer aborted missions, fewer emergency landings, fewer pilots ditching in the ocean because they'd miscalculated their reserves. But fuel efficiency was only half of what Lindbergh brought to the Pacific. The other half would literally reshape how Marines used the Corsair in combat. By early June, Lindbergh had moved from Marine squadrons to Army P-38 units, spending time with the 475th Fighter Group in New Guinea. There, working with Colonel Charles MacDonald and ace pilots like Thomas Maguire, he refined his fuel conservation techniques for twin-engine aircraft. The P-38's Allison engines responded even better to lean cruise settings than the Corsair's radial. Within weeks, Army pilots were extending their combat radius from 570 miles to over 700 miles, allowing them to escort bombers to targets that had previously been beyond fighter range. But Lindbergh hadn't forgotten about the Corsair. In late August, preparing to return to the United States, he stopped at the Marshall Islands to visit Marine Air Group 31. Captain Francis Clark immediately sought him out. Clark had his centerline bomb rack designs. He had the engineering calculations. What he didn't have was anyone willing to actually test whether a Corsair could take off, maneuver, dive bomb, and land with a load that exceeded every published specification. Lindbergh looked at Clark's drawings, asked a few questions about attachment points and load distribution, then said something that would become legendary in marine aviation. "Let's find out tomorrow." The test that began on September 2nd, 1944, wasn't just about proving the Corsair could carry more weight. It was about changing the fundamental assumptions that governed how Marine squadrons operated. Every aircraft had official specifications: maximum takeoff weight, maximum ordnance load, maximum fuel capacity. These numbers came from engineers who'd run calculations and conducted tests under controlled conditions. The numbers represented safe, conservative limits that would work 99% of the time under 99% of conditions. But wars aren't won by 99% solutions. They're won by pilots and engineers and mechanics who understand that specifications are guidelines, not laws of physics. The Corsair's airframe could handle stress loads far beyond what the manual indicated. The engine could produce power levels higher than the official ratings. The propeller could bite into the air with more authority than Vought's test pilots had demonstrated. All it took was someone willing to push past the paper limits and discover what the machine could actually do. September 2nd began with 20 Corsairs taking off from Taroa, each carrying a single 1,000-pound bomb. Standard mission, standard ordnance, standard procedures. Lindbergh flew number 17 in the formation, diving from 8,000 feet at 60 degrees, releasing at 3,000, watching his bomb fall toward Japanese gun positions on the island. Most of the ordnance landed in the target area. A fuel fire started, sending black smoke spiraling into the tropical sky. Mission successful by any measure. But Lindbergh spent the return flight thinking about those bunkers full of 2,000-pound bombs, thinking about how many sorties it would take to reduce a fortified position using 1,000-pounders, thinking about pilots making multiple runs through anti-aircraft fire, each pass increasing the chances of being shot down, thinking about the mathematics of explosive force and structural engineering and what 3,000 pounds of high explosive delivered in a single strike could accomplish. That evening, he found Captain Clark and a young marine engineering officer whose name wasn't recorded in any official report. Together, they worked past midnight, sketching modifications to Clark's centerline rack design, calculating center of gravity shifts, determining attachment points that would distribute load properly across the Corsair's structure. By dawn, they had a plan. By noon, they had a prototype rack fabricated from materials scrounged around, the base. By early afternoon, they had 3,000-pound bombs, one on the center line and one under each wing, mounted on a Corsair that, according to every official document, couldn't possibly carry that load. Lindbergh conducted his pre-flight inspection with the methodical attention that had characterized his entire aviation career. He checked fuel levels. He examined the bomb rack attachment points, looking for any sign of stress or improper fit. He ran his hands along the fuselage, feeling for anything that seemed wrong. The Corsair sat low on its landing gear, the weight of ordnance pressing down. The tail wheel barely touched the ground. Any error during takeoff rotation, any miscalculation of speed or angle, would result in the tail dragging or the aircraft nosing over or a dozen other catastrophic outcomes. He climbed into the cockpit, started the engine, ran through his checks, then he advanced the throttle and began his takeoff roll. The Corsair accelerated slowly, grudgingly, fighting the weight of 3,000 pounds of bombs plus full internal fuel. The coral strip blurred beneath him. The far end approached faster than on a standard takeoff. He could feel the aircraft wanting to fly but not quite ready, still building speed, still finding the energy to overcome gravity and lift all that weight into the tropical air. At the moment when most pilots would have aborted, convinced the aircraft wouldn't make it, Lindbergh eased back on the stick. The Corsair lifted. Not smoothly, not gracefully, but it lifted. He held it in ground effect, letting it accelerate, letting the propeller bite deeper into the air, letting physics and engineering and 17 years of flying experience tell him exactly when to commit to the climb. Then he was airborne, climbing at a rate that would terrify any instructor but was sufficient for combat operations, heading toward Vought Island with a payload that would let him demonstrate once and for all that the official specifications were just the beginning of what a determined pilot could accomplish. The targets on Vought were gun emplacements and supply bunkers that had resisted weeks of bombardment. Lindbergh dove from 8,000 feet, the Corsair handling differently with all that extra weight, requiring more rudder input to keep the nose aligned, responding more slowly to control inputs, but still fundamentally stable. At 3,000 feet, he released all 3 bombs in sequence, one from the center line, then one from each wing, watching them fall toward the Japanese positions below. The explosions when they hit were spectacular. 3,000 pounds of high explosive delivered simultaneously created shockwaves that flattened structures, collapsed bunkers, and sent debris cascading across the island. It was the kind of destructive power usually reserved for heavy bombers, now delivered by a single fighter aircraft that could defend itself against any Japanese plane that might challenge it. Lindbergh pulled out of his dive, feeling the Corsair respond immediately, the reduced weight making it nimble again. He climbed back to altitude, checked his fuel gauges using the lean cruise techniques he'd taught the Marines, and turned for home. Behind him, Vought burned. Ahead of him, an entire new doctrine of fighter-bomber operations waited to be written. When he landed back at Taroa, taxiing to the hard stand where ground crews and squadron officers waited, Lindbergh shut down the engine and climbed out to find Captain Clark grinning like he'd just won the war single-handedly. The test had worked. The Corsair could haul 3,000 pounds and still perform every function required of a combat aircraft. But Lindbergh wasn't done. That was just the proof of concept. On September 8th, working with Clark and the Marine engineering officer, they fabricated a modified centerline rack capable of handling a single 2,000-pound bomb. This time, Lindbergh took off, with one massive bomb under the fuselage, the largest ordnance ever carried by a single-engine fighter in combat operations. He flew to Vought again, dove again, released at 3,000 feet again, and watched the 2,000-pound bomb obliterate its target with a detonation that could be felt from miles away. The implications rippled through marine aviation within days. If the Corsair could handle 2,000 pounds on the center line, what about adding 1,000-pounders under the wings as well? On September 12th and 13th, Lindbergh flew his final combat missions of the war. One 2,000-pound bomb on the center line, 2,000-pound bombs under the wings, 4,000 pounds total. It was probably the heaviest bomb load ever attached to a Corsair, transforming the fighter into a platform capable of delivering strike package that could alter the battlefield in a single run. But even as Lindbergh demonstrated these new capabilities, he continued teaching the fuel conservation techniques that would prove equally important. The extended range meant Marines could reach targets that had been beyond their operational radius. The increased loiter time meant they could provide close air support for extended periods, circling over embattled positions, delivering precision strikes when called by forward observers, staying on station while other fighters had to depart to refuel. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation of Corsair operations didn't happen overnight, but it happened fast enough to matter while the war was still being fought. By late September, Marine squadrons throughout the Pacific were incorporating Lindbergh's techniques. Pilots learned to run their engines at 1400 RPM and 30 inches manifold pressure during cruise. They monitored cylinder head temperatures religiously, keeping them at 226 degrees Celsius, just hot enough for efficient combustion, but cool enough to avoid damage. They extended their range by 200 miles, sometimes more depending on winds and mission profiles. And they started loading their aircraft with ordnance loads that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. The field modifications that Captain Clark and others had improvised became standardized installations. Factories started producing the F4U 1D variant with strengthened bomb pylons and improved fuel systems. The Corsair transitioned from being primarily an air superiority fighter to becoming the Marine Corps' primary close air support platform, capable of delivering devastating strikes against ground targets while still maintaining the ability to engage enemy aircraft if necessary. The human cost of these innovations was measurable in lives saved rather than lives lost. Extended range meant fewer pilots ditching in the ocean because they'd run out of fuel short of base. Increased bomb loads meant fewer sorties required to neutralize hardened targets, which meant fewer passes through anti-aircraft fire, which meant fewer aircraft shot down. And the psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. They'd learned to fear B-24 raids, but those came at predictable intervals with predictable approach patterns. Corsairs could appear anywhere, anytime, carrying enough ordnance to collapse bunkers and destroy supply dumps, then disappear back into the sky before Japanese fighters could scramble to intercept. The statistical evidence compiled after the war showed the magnitude of Lindbergh's contribution. Between September 1944 and the end of hostilities in August 1945, Marine Corsair squadrons flew over 64,000 operational sorties. They shot down over 2,000 Japanese aircraft while losing only 189 Corsairs to enemy action. The kill ratio was remarkable, but the operational efficiency was even more impressive. Missions that would have required multiple flights were accomplished in single sorties. Targets that would have required heavy bomber strikes were neutralized by 4 or 6 Corsairs working in coordination. And the fuel efficiency meant that more of the precious gasoline reaching forward bases translated into actual combat operations rather than being burned during transit. The engineers at Vought aircraft, when they learned what Lindbergh had demonstrated, experienced a mixture of pride and mild embarrassment. Their aircraft had performed beyond its rated specifications, which validated their design work, but it had taken a civilian pilot, operating in combat conditions, to discover capabilities that years of peacetime testing had missed. The technical reports that filtered back to Connecticut led to revised specifications for later Corsair variants. The F4U series that entered service in late 1944 incorporated design improvements that reflected the lessons learned from Lindbergh's experimental flights: higher rated engine power, strengthened attachment points for external ordnance, improved fuel management systems that made lean cruise operations easier for pilots to implement. But the real legacy wasn't in the specifications, it was in the mindset change that rippled through naval aviation. The idea that official limits were starting points rather than absolute constraints. The understanding that combat operations required different thinking than peacetime testing. The recognition that experienced pilots, working with knowledgeable mechanics and engineers, could safely push aircraft beyond their published capabilities when the tactical situation demanded it. Lindbergh's fuel conservation techniques spread beyond just Corsair squadrons. Army P-38 units that he'd worked with in New Guinea continued using his methods long after he'd returned to the United States. By late 1944, P-38 pilots were routinely flying missions that exceeded 700 miles combat radius. allowing them to escort B-24 bombers to targets throughout the Southwest Pacific. Some missions reached 800 miles, which would have been absolutely impossible using standard fuel management procedures. The Navy eventually formalized many of Lindbergh's innovations. Technical orders were revised to include lean cruise settings as optional procedures for experienced pilots operating under specific conditions. Training programs began teaching new pilots about fuel efficiency, engine management, and the relationship between mixture settings and cylinder head temperatures. What had started as one pilot's willingness to question official procedures became standard doctrine taught at flight schools throughout the United States. Yet for all the documented impact, for all the missions enabled and lives saved, Lindbergh himself received no official recognition, no medal, no formal commendation, not even a mention in most official histories of marine aviation during World War II. Part of this reflected his civilian status. Awards and decorations went to military personnel, not contractors. Part of it reflected the ongoing political complications surrounding his pre-war stance, and part of it reflected Lindbergh's own preference for remaining in the background, letting the work speak for itself rather than seeking public acknowledgement. In his private journals, Lindbergh recorded detailed observations about his Pacific tour, the technical aspects of fuel management and bomb loading, the psychology of combat flying, the courage of pilots half his age who flew daily into anti-aircraft fire without complaint, but he wrote relatively little about his own contributions, treating them as natural extensions of problems that needed solving rather than achievements worthy of special recognition. The Marine pilots who flew with Lindbergh remembered him, differently than the history books would. To them, he wasn't the controversial figure who'd opposed American entry into the war. He wasn't the celebrity aviator whose transatlantic flight had made him famous worldwide. He was simply a pilot who understood aircraft at a fundamental level and was willing to share that knowledge without condescension or ego. Lieutenant Robert Schuler of VMF 113 recalled decades later that Lindbergh spent hours with junior pilots, explaining the theory behind lean cruise operations, walking them through the mathematics of fuel consumption, making sure they understood not just what to do, but why it worked. That willingness to teach, to share knowledge rather than hoard it, multiplied the impact of his innovations far beyond what any single pilot could accomplish. Every Marine who learned his techniques taught others. Every squadron that adopted his procedures passed them along to replacement pilots arriving from the States. The knowledge cascaded through the system, becoming part of the institutional wisdom of marine aviation. The technical aspects of what Lindbergh taught were relatively straightforward, once pilots understood the underlying principles. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, like most radial engines, operated most efficiently at specific combinations of RPM and manifold pressure. The manual specified higher RPM settings because they provided safety margins and reduced the risk of detonation under varying conditions. But those safety margins consumed fuel unnecessarily when conditions were optimal and pilots were experienced enough to monitor their instruments carefully. By reducing RPM to 1400, while increasing manifold pressure to 30 inches, Lindbergh created a power setting that generated the same thrust as standard cruise while burning significantly less fuel per hour. The key was maintaining proper mixture control. Too lean, and cylinder head temperatures would spike, risking detonation and engine damage. Too rich, and the fuel savings disappeared. The sweet spot was narrow, requiring constant attention, but pilots who mastered it found they could extend their range by 20 to 25% without any modification to the aircraft itself. The physics behind this were well understood by engine engineers, but the practical application in combat operations had never been systematically explored. Peacetime testing focused on reliability and safety under worst-case conditions. Combat pilots focused on completing their missions and surviving. The intersection between optimal efficiency and operational effectiveness existed in a space that nobody had thoroughly investigated until Lindbergh arrived with his notebook and his willingness to experiment. His approach to the bomb load problem followed similar logic. The structural engineers at Vought had calculated maximum loads based on specific assumptions about acceleration forces during takeoff, maneuvering stress during combat, and landing impacts. These calculations included safety factors, multiplying the expected loads by coefficients that ensured the aircraft could handle unexpected situations. But those safety factors meant the actual structural capability exceeded the published specifications by significant margins. Lindbergh, working with Captain Clark, essentially reverse-engineered the safety factors. They examined the attachment points, calculated the actual stress loads during different flight phases, and determined that the airframe could handle considerably more weight than the manual indicated, provided pilots accepted slightly longer takeoff rolls, slightly slower climb rates, and slightly more careful handling during the approach and landing. The risk assessment wasn't cavalier. Lindbergh understood that exceeding published limits meant operating with reduced margins for error. A pilot who bounced the landing with 4,000 pounds of bombs aboard would face consequences that wouldn't occur with standard ordnance loads. An engine failure during takeoff with maximum weight could be catastrophic, where it might be survivable under normal conditions. But these were calculated risks, acceptable in combat operations where the alternative was flying multiple sorties through enemy fire to achieve the same objective. The bombing missions Lindbergh flew in early September 1944 demonstrated another aspect of his approach to aviation. He wasn't content to prove something could be done once under ideal conditions. He wanted to establish that it could be done reliably, repeatedly, by average pilots under combat stress. So he flew multiple missions with different bomb loads, testing various configurations, documenting what worked and what didn't, creating a body of practical knowledge that could be passed to squadron operations officers. His mission on September 3rd, dropping 3,000-pound bombs on Vought, proved the concept. His mission on September 8th, dropping the single 2,000-pound bomb, demonstrated that even heavier individual weapons could be employed. And his missions on September 12th and 13th, hauling the full 4,000 pounds, established the absolute upper limit of what a Corsair could realistically carry into combat. But perhaps more importantly, those missions were flown against actual targets defended by actual Japanese forces. Lindbergh wasn't testing in a vacuum. He was diving through anti-aircraft fire, dealing with the normal vagaries of combat flying, demonstrating that these heavy loads could be employed tactically, not just technically. The Japanese gunners on Vought had every opportunity to shoot him down. They fired at him just like they fired at every other Marine pilot who attacked their positions. The fact that he survived and completed his missions proved that the additional weight didn't compromise the Corsair's ability to evade ground fire or maneuver defensively. The immediate tactical impact was significant, but the strategic implications were perhaps more important. By mid-September 1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase where logistics and efficiency mattered as much as combat capability. The Navy had more aircraft than it had fuel to operate them, more targets than it had bombs to hit them, more missions than it had pilots to fly them. Anything that improved efficiency, that let fewer sorties accomplish more destruction, that reduced the logistical burden on an already strained supply chain, directly contributed to the speed of the American advance toward Japan. Lindbergh's innovations did exactly that. A squadron of 12 Corsairs, each carrying 4,000 pounds of ordnance instead of the standard 1,000 pounds, could deliver 48,000 pounds of high explosive in a single strike. That was equivalent to 6 B-24 heavy bombers, except the Corsairs could defend themselves, could caters, operate from short coral strips that couldn't handle bombers, and required a fraction of the fuel and maintenance that keeping 6 B-24s operational would demand. The extended range provided by fuel-efficient cruise settings had similar strategic value. Marine squadrons could now provide close air support for amphibious operations from bases farther from the target, which reduced the urgency of capturing airfields close to the fighting. They could escort transport aircraft over longer distances, providing security for supply runs that kept forward units operational. They could conduct reconnaissance missions that penetrated deeper into Japanese-held territory, gathering intelligence that informed planning for future operations. By October 1944, barely a month after Lindbergh's demonstration flights, Marine Corsair squadrons were routinely operating with the techniques and tactics he'd pioneered. The transition wasn't seamless. Some pilots struggled with the discipline required for lean cruise operations. Some squadron commanders remained skeptical about exceeding published bomb load limits, but the evidence was overwhelming. Squadrons that adopted the new procedures accomplished more with fewer resources. They suffered lower loss rates because they flew fewer sorties to achieve the same objectives. And pilot confidence increased as they realized they had capabilities that Japanese defenders couldn't anticipate. The Japanese response to these tactical changes was documented in intelligence reports, compiled from captured documents and prisoner interrogations after the war. Japanese commanders on bypassed islands reported that American fighter-bomber attacks had become significantly more destructive, starting in late 1944. They noted that individual aircraft seemed to carry much larger bomb loads than earlier in the war. They observed that American fighters were appearing over targets that had previously been beyond their range. But they couldn't understand why these changes had occurred, attributing them to new aircraft variants or different American tactics, rather than recognizing that the same Corsairs they'd been facing for months had simply started operating more efficiently. That intelligence failure on the Japanese side reflected a broader issue in their military doctrine. The Imperial Japanese forces emphasized courage, determination, and adherence to established procedures. Innovation was valued when it came from senior commanders or institutional channels, but field improvisation by junior officers or enlisted personnel was often discouraged. The idea that a civilian contractor could fundamentally alter combat capabilities through simple procedural changes would have seemed alien to Japanese military culture. The American approach, particularly in the Marine Corps, was different. Junior officers like Captain Clark were expected to solve problems creatively. Technical representatives like Lindbergh were given access to operational units and encouraged to contribute ideas. And when those ideas proved effective, they were rapidly disseminated through informal networks of pilots and mechanics who communicated across squadron and unit boundaries. This cultural difference in how innovation was fostered and implemented gave American forces a significant advantage that complemented their material superiority. Lindbergh's contribution to this culture of innovation extended beyond just the specific techniques he taught. His presence in combat zones, flying missions alongside 20-year-old pilots, demonstrated that age and celebrity status didn't exempt anyone from shared danger. His willingness to admit when he didn't know something, to ask questions of mechanics and junior pilots, to treat everyone as potential sources of valuable knowledge, created an environment where ideas could flow freely without regard to rank or position. Several Marine officers who interacted with Lindbergh in the Pacific later credited him with influencing their own approaches to leadership and problem-solving. They saw how he combined theoretical knowledge with practical experimentation, how he respected official procedures while recognizing when those procedures needed to be questioned, how he took calculated risks based on careful analysis rather than reckless chances based on bravado. These lessons in judgment and decision-making under pressure proved valuable throughout their military careers. The story of Lindbergh's Pacific tour also illuminated the complex relationship between civilian expertise and military operations. The armed forces in World War II relied heavily on civilian contractors, technical representatives, and consultants. Aircraft manufacturers sent engineers to forward bases to troubleshoot problems with their products. Engine companies dispatched specialists to help maintain complex power plants in harsh environments. Electronics firms provided technicians to install and repair radar systems, but Lindbergh occupied a unique position in this ecosystem. He wasn't just a technical representative explaining how the equipment worked. He was a pilot with more hours in more different aircraft than most active-duty aviators would accumulate in entire careers. He was an engineer by inclination, if not by formal education, someone who understood the mathematics and physics underlying aircraft performance. And he was a problem solver who approached challenges with fresh perspectives unburdened by institutional assumptions. The fact that he was also one of the most famous people in America created both opportunities and complications. His presence attracted attention that military commanders sometimes found uncomfortable. The press wanted to write stories about Lindbergh's combat missions, which risked revealing tactical information to the enemy. Political opponents back in the United States criticized the military for allowing someone with Lindbergh's pre-war record to participate in combat operations, and the Roosevelt administration would have been furious if they'd known the extent of his activities, which is precisely why his participation was kept quiet through careful bureaucratic maneuvering. Yet, despite these complications, or perhaps because of them, Lindbergh's tour of the Pacific represented exactly the kind of civil-military cooperation that democracies excel at during wartime. The military's willingness to accept help from civilian experts, even controversial ones, reflected an institutional pragmatism that totalitarian systems struggled to match. The ability of people like Brigadier General Louis Woods to circumvent official channels when those channels prevented effective action demonstrated adaptive leadership. And the rapid adoption of innovations, regardless of their source, showed an organization focused on winning rather than protecting bureaucratic prerogatives. The broader context of the Pacific War in late 1944 helps explain why Lindbergh's contributions mattered so much at that particular moment. The American advance had reached a phase where every mile toward Japan required crossing water and seizing islands. Each invasion needed air support, both to suppress enemy defenses before the landings and to provide close air support once ground forces were engaged. The demand for fighter-bomber sorties was essentially unlimited, constrained only by the number of aircraft available and the fuel to operate them. At the same time, the logistical challenge of supporting operations across thousands of miles of ocean was reaching critical complexity. Every gallon of aviation gasoline had to be transported from refineries in the United States or the Dutch East Indies to forward bases on tiny coral atolls. Every bomb and bullet had to travel the same route. The shipping required for this support consumed resources that might otherwise have been used to transport troops, equipment, or supplies. Anything that reduced consumption without reducing effectiveness directly contributed to operational tempo. Lindbergh's fuel efficiency techniques reduced the amount of gasoline required for each sortie by roughly 20 to 25%. Across the thousands of Corsair missions flown each month, that translated to millions of gallons of fuel saved, fuel that didn't need to be shipped, stored, and distributed. Fuel that could be allocated to other purposes or kept in reserve for future operations. The cumulative impact on logistics was substantial enough that senior Navy officers took notice and began pushing for formal adoption of the procedures. Similarly, the increased bomb loads meant each sortie delivered more ordnance per gallon of fuel consumed, improving the efficiency ratio further. A Corsair carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs instead of 1,000 delivered 4 times the destructive power, while consuming only slightly more fuel due to the added weight. The return on logistical investment improved dramatically, which mattered enormously to operations planners trying to allocate scarce resources across multiple simultaneous campaigns. The human dimension of these technical improvements was perhaps most visible in the reduced loss rates that squadrons experienced after adopting Lindbergh's methods. Fewer sorties required to accomplish objectives meant fewer exposures to enemy fire. Extended range meant fewer emergency landings and fuel exhaustion incidents. Both factors contributed to more pilots surviving to complete their tours and return home. The lives saved weren't dramatic, weren't visible in the way that a successful fighter engagement or bombing mission was visible, but they accumulated steadily as the war continued. Lieutenant James Morrison of VMF 214 flew his first combat missions in October 1944, just as Lindbergh's techniques were becoming standard practice in Marine squadrons. In interviews conducted 50 years later, Morrison recalled how the squadron's veterans emphasized fuel management as much as gunnery or tactics. They told us that running out of gas was just as deadly as getting shot down, he remembered. Maybe more deadly, because at least if you got shot down fighting, you'd gone down trying. Running out of fuel was just stupid, and there was no excuse for it if you knew how to manage your engine properly. That emphasis on fuel discipline became part of marine aviation culture, persisting long after World War II ended. Pilots in Korea, flying Corsairs in ground attack missions, used the same cruise settings that Lindbergh had taught pilots a decade earlier. Even as jets replaced propeller-driven aircraft, the underlying principle remained relevant. Efficient operation extended range and endurance, reducing logistical demands and increasing operational flexibility. The specific techniques changed with different engines and aircraft, but the mindset of questioning published limits and seeking optimal performance became embedded in naval aviation training. The bomb load innovations followed a different trajectory. As the Corsair evolved through successive variants, the factory-installed hardpoints and bomb racks were strengthened to handle heavier loads as standard equipment. The F4U series that entered service in late 1944 officially rated for 4,000 pounds of external stores, reflecting in its design specifications what Lindbergh and Captain Clark had demonstrated through field modifications. By the Korean War, Corsairs were routinely carrying mixed loads of bombs, rockets, and napalm totaling well over 4,000 pounds, missions that would have seemed impossible to the Marine pilots flying in early 1944. But the path from Lindbergh's experimental flights to official specifications wasn't direct or simple. Engineers at Vought had to validate the field modifications through formal testing. Military procurement officers had to approve design changes and authorize production modifications. Squadron commanders had to develop tactics and procedures that safely employed the increased capabilities. The process took months, which meant Lindbergh's demonstrations in September were impacting operational squadrons by December and January, just as the campaigns in the Philippines and at Iwo Jima created massive demands for close air support. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March 1945 showcased what Marine Corsairs could accomplish with the full suite of capabilities that Lindbergh's work had helped develop. Squadrons operating from newly captured airfields provided continuous close air support for Marines fighting in the volcanic ash and fortified caves. They carried maximum bomb loads, hitting strongpoints that ground forces couldn't reduce with infantry weapons. They extended their loiter time through efficient fuel management, remaining on station to respond to calls for fire support. And they demonstrated the kind of responsive, flexible air power that became a hallmark of Marine Corps operations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.